Nina, unless you want to say any greetings, I can introduce you now.
You can introduce me now.
Okay, grand. Nina is an artist, curator, and researcher who has worked extensively and so comprehensively across art, science, and technology over many decades. She is part of the Intercreate Aotearoa network, a truly valued part of it, and has served as its chair for over a decade. And she is also a board member of Leonardo ISAST, International Society for the Arts, Sciences and Technology, and curating some very exciting projects that maybe we will hear more about on the theme of light. So
if I may say
of course,
one
yeah.
addition, it is the Leonardo Laser, the Leonardo Arts and Science Evenings rendezvous, which are an independent organization but connected to Leonardo, and we are at 50 places around the world, all individually organized.
Thank you. It's great, and you can see many of those conversations online, actually. Now to introduce Gabriela Radulescu. I was schooled on how to say your surname by Harry, and I feel like I feel like I haven't got the true essence of it, Gabriela. But I'm so glad to have you here. Gabriela is a Guggenheim postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. She holds a PhD in the history of science from the Technical University of Berlin, and her dissertation, A History of Communication with Extraterrestrial Intelligence, SETI, Astronautics, and Radio Astronomy Across the Iron Curtain, 1956 to 1976, examines the political and cultural and historical origins of SETI. And on a personal note, I first saw Gabriela present her work after I had had a very complex experience boycotting the 2023 International Astronautical Congress in Baku when they invaded and ethnically cleansed Nagorno-Karabakh. And at that time, I was urging my colleagues to investigate Armenia's place in SETI. And only a week later did I attend an event at the Warburg Institute in London, where I saw Gabriela present her work on how Armenia truly does play a pivotal role in the early history of SETI. And her research, it couldn't be more careful and dedicated. It's such a beautiful ethnographic analysis of the early development, particularly through the fieldwork at the Byurakan Astrophysical Observatory in Armenia. So with just a little indication about how we'll manage time, we will begin with a presentation from Gabriela, maybe around 40 minutes, 30 minutes, and then Nina may then make her response. And at the end of the call, we will open up for a general discussion. So thank you so much. And Gabriela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for a very nice introduction and for the very kind words. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. In the later part of the 20th century, three simultaneous developments were set in motion by human technological access to non-optical electromagnetic waves in the universe. That is, this technological breakthrough enabled radio astronomers to observe a much wider range of naturally occurring astrophysical phenomena. Astronautics engineered to control vehicles launched into space, like satellites, rockets, and the investigation of the existence of extraterrestrial intelligent beings evolved into a legitimate empirical pursuit. A diverse group of natural and social scientists, deeply embedded in the Cold War geopolitics, contributed to SETI, a collaborative journey. During the space age, the idea of communicating with other beings in the universe emerged both in astronomy and astronautics. From the second half of the 20th century, humans could confidently see into the universe beyond visible light. Although evidence existed that the universe emitted radiation in non-optical wavelengths and that this could potentially be explored for astronomy since the interwar period, radio astronomy would reach its maturity as a field only during the space age. Walter Sullivan, who thoroughly documented radio astronomy's history, noted how on the 27th of April 1933, At the International Scientific Radio Union meeting, a small audience in Washington, D.C. received with lukewarm interest a paper presenting empirical evidence that the universe emitted radio waves. The author, Karl Jansky, was a radio physics engineer who worked at the US radio telephonic company Bell Laboratories. His task was to determine unwanted noise and interference. This moment, in retrospect, is regarded as the start of radio astronomy, although Jansky's work would remain in the shadows until later. After World War II, communities of radio physicists, engineers, and rarely classically trained astronomers teamed up to study the universe in non-optical light, mostly radio. Up until the late 1950s, radio astronomy still, however, had not impressed real astronomers. This changed radically in the early 1960s. Sullivan further noted that the detailed study of extraterrestrial radio waves has unquestionably been one of the key developments in the astronomy of our 20th century. Sullivan gave three major reasons in this sense. First, a host of unexpected phenomena came to be known. After the discovery of radio galaxies, quasars, pulsars, the cosmic background radiation, and complex interstellar molecules, the universe would never again be the same, wrote Sullivan. Second, radio astronomy naturalized the use of electronics and changed the nature of the training that astronomers undergo. Third, radio astronomy started the continual opening up of the electromagnetic spectrum. Astronomy exists today as a result of what started as a marginal and marginalized field in the mid-20th century. And in radio astronomy, the SETI period corresponds, for communication with extraterrestrial intelligence period, with what historians describe as the golden age of radio astronomy, more or less 1960-1975. And this is the period when the field of radio astronomy had become recognized finally by classically trained astronomers, and these major discoveries took place. In astronautics, the same ability to use these electromagnetic waves to see the invisible universe manifested itself through space communication. People on Earth could transmit messages and communicate with various crewed or uncrewed vehicles. The space age's idea of electromagnetic messages to and from other intelligent beings in the universe has prominent roots in the late 19th and early 20th century, when visionary thinking of interplanetary flights intertwined with religious and spiritual ideas. The notion of sending thoughts into the cosmos separated from the body, allowing the spiritual one to travel out in space beyond the celestial bodies, has deep roots in religious and mystical thinking across cultures and time periods. Modern Western science had definitely integrated this idea into an imaginary encompassing scientific and technological ideas. The first, that is astronomical revolution, changed how astronomers gain knowledge. The second, astronautical, enabled humans to be present in space, to see themselves from space, to globalize surveillance, and to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles. In other words, perhaps what is called intelligence. Both revolutions thus mark a radical change in human perception of the universe and the possibilities of interacting with it. This period also saw a change in the question of whether there were other intelligent beings in the universe. Scientists developed the idea that some waves across the electromagnetic spectrum in the universe could be artificial signals, that is, signals produced by the same type of technological activity that humans were capable of. This was mostly conceived under the idea of interstellar communications, assuming that extraterrestrial civilizations would already be sending messages. Conversely, humans also became aware that they might become the ones transmitting. The double meaning of intelligence as an epistemic object for astronomy, as extraterrestrial intelligence, as well as the open and clandestine collection of information, the organization and implementation of covert operation, and the systematic analysis of adversary intentions and capabilities, is significant for the history of SETI. SETI lobbyists and scientists muse on the possible existence of intelligent beings organized into civilizations in the universe, brainstorming on the latter's intentions and capabilities. As such, conceptualizing concrete ways of identifying alien technological intentions and capabilities was at the heart of SETI research. Equally, SETI scientists discussed how civilizations, given certain intentions and capabilities, might risk destroying themselves. Thus, collecting intelligence and musing on what paths intelligence might lead to were at the heart of the field of SETI. In 1964, scientists from the Soviet Union convened at the Byurakan Astrophysical Observatory in the Soviet Republic of Armenia for the first all-union conference on extraterrestrial civilizations and communication with them conference. The USSR Academy of Sciences and its local Armenian counterpart were the official organizers. Apart from Russia and Armenia, no other republic was represented at the event. The conference addressed the newly emerged preoccupation of astronomers with detecting electromagnetic signals from possibly existing extraterrestrial civilizations. This was the main and only all-Soviet gathering of the time, focusing on this epistemic object. As one of the few non-Russian Soviet republics to develop radio astronomy that early, owing to Byurakan's director Viktor Ambartsumian, Armenia was a natural location for the new study of distant civilizations. In the opening speech for the conference, Ambartsumian stated the aim and scope of the event: to organize a comprehensive, all-sided discussion on the problem of extraterrestrial civilizations. He went on, in particular, Soviet science could not bypass the question of the existence of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe and the problem of establishing interstellar communications. The conference was supposed thereby to define correctly at least some of the problems pertaining to extraterrestrial civilizations and in delineating the first steps to be taken toward a solution. This showed that the aim was to ground the question of extraterrestrial civilizations in Soviet science, which for radio astronomy, not least, meant obtaining the support of its military and politically powerful actors. The study of extraterrestrials in the Soviet Union depended on political decisions, and the military, since access to radio astronomy facilities and programs were difficult. The discussions at the conference show the presence of ideas inspired by military-infused scenarios. Yakov Borisovich Zeldovich had no less than 10 highly regarded Soviet awards, medals, and honorary titles at the time of the conference, that is for military achievements. Zeldovich's presence at the Soviet Conference on Extraterrestrial Intelligence corresponded with the turning point of his transition from a more applied military science to academic research. Among others, Zeldovich played an instrumental role in the Soviet nuclear bomb project. He did not present at the conference, but contributed with engaged comments. Notably, Zeldovich drew attention at the conference to the possibility of detecting nuclear explosions over interstellar distances through the electromagnetic radiation they generate. He said, I quote, "High-altitude nuclear explosions generate intense electromagnetic radiation, which in some cases is more powerful than the radiation of terrestrial radio stations, and in principle can be detected at an interstellar range. Attention, therefore, should be paid to other modes of signal generation." The relationship between the Armenian and the Russian discourses on extraterrestrial civilizations speaks at least partly for the role that Armenia held in validating or advancing the topic. Armenian contributions to extraterrestrial civilizations discussions harmonized with the general tone at the conference. Armenian scientist, physicist, and engineer Paris Heruni counteracted skepticism in communication across the interstellar space between civilizations. After sufficient arguments were given to support the idea that contact will be most probably possible with a civilization more advanced than humanity, Heruni affirmed, I quote, "Alien civilizations picking up transmissions may have aggressive tendencies. It is in this sense that we should speak of healthy and unhealthy civilizations. Since our civilization is very young, our first contact in all probability will be made with more advanced civilizations. Civilizations which have reached a high level of development can be expected to be healthy. It should also seem that a healthy civilization will attempt to establish two-way communication with other civilizations, to gain new knowledge and to allow others to profit by this knowledge. A transmission of information is properly considered a duty of more or less advanced civilizations. The fact that civilizations that have reached a technological level capable of and willing to establish communication with others in the universe must have been healthy provided a source of scientific technological optimism for scientists. Heruni's solution to potential violence in the universe subscribed to the more considerable scientific technical optimism among the scientific intelligentsia across the Soviet Union. The strong link between scientific technological development and moral or diplomatic qualities created a continuum in which humans could have joined the Healthy Civilizations Club. The possibility of humans developing a similar technical possibility became a home for such health. Perhaps as long as this link was preserved, Soviet power would stand on the side of extraterrestrial civilizations. Thereby, Heruni's interventions strengthened the implicit necessity of all Soviet support for radio astronomy's study of extraterrestrial civilizations. The fact that many, or the majority of Soviet, Russian, and Armenian space scientists converged in their optimism on extraterrestrial civilizations allows some observations on a presumably all-union, or at least trans-union, between Russia and Armenia intelligentsia's trust in science and technology. The participants fully embodied the scientific intelligentsia's features according to the definition of Soviet science anthropologist and Armenian science anthropologist Yulia Antonian. Antonian defined the intelligentsia as a social stratum of people who earn their living through intellectual labor, and that in Soviet times, she mentioned this definition was complicated by intelligentsia's roundness, their preoccupation, their interdisciplinarity, and openness to different intellectual ideas. Now, the preoccupation with humanities and arts did not lack in Byurakan's extraterrestrial voices at the conference. Heruni developed his preoccupation with ancient Armenian history and archaeoastronomy into a second career that almost replaced his initial one in the physical sciences. Equally, Byurakan's astrophysicist Elma Parsanyan manifested also an interest in ancient Armenian historical research and was present also at the 1964 conference. In talking about her generation of intellectuals, Parsanyan declared there were people everywhere, that is, in the intellectual circles, interested in both the science and history of Armenia. The interdisciplinary object of extraterrestrial civilizations that Moscow launched spoke to the intelligentsia at the periphery of the Soviet Union. However, neither anyone at Baon nor in Armenia became involved Byurakan, that is, or in Armenia, became involved in radio astronomy study of extraterrestrial civilizations before or after the conference. There is no current satisfying overview of how many other SETI-related publications in the Soviet bloc or other places on the globe except for the US existed, especially in the early to mid-1960s. The subject of interstellar communications surfaced in several areas, but there is very little evidence of the willingness to bring it into international focus before 1965. The International Academy of Astronautics, or the IAA, was a young organization founded in 1960 that gathered individuals who had already proven themselves in natural or social sciences related to astronautics. The IAA also aimed to harmonize with other diplomatic efforts at the time. Its motto went, I quote, "The international character of the Academy's activities is in harmony with the efforts of the United Nations to obtain agreement among the member states to peaceful uses of outer space." Extraterrestrial intelligence momentum was building up in the IAA, which the Soviet Union joined in 1964, shortly after the Byurakan Conference. The IAA held its regular meeting in June 1965 in the French capital, where it was based. On this occasion, Czechoslovakian engineer and leading member of the IAA, Rudolf Pesek, traveled as both a member of its board of trustees and chair of the engineering sciences section of the IAA. He proposed organizing an international symposium on communication with extraterrestrial intelligences, and informed the IAA Presidium that Czechoslovakia could host a symposium that would unite East and West of the Iron Curtain. At the end of the meeting, the Board of Trustees decided that Pesek would write to the scientific workers who might be interested in the topic and consider whether such a symposium would be necessary within the next 2 years. Judging by the logistical standards of the time, Pesek's actions unfolded quickly. About a month later, written terrestrial communications on SETI commenced. Pesek sent a template letter to approximately 50 scientists. The engineer wrote that the Board of Trustees considered not without sympathy a suggestion of mine to examine possibilities and limits of communication with extraterrestrial intelligences at a special symposium in 1966 or 1967. Pesek continuing informing the correspondence that he had the honor to be entrusted to approach a very limited number of distinguished scientists and asked whether such a subject is mature enough to be discussed. Pesek then laid out in the letter 5 categories of problems of SETI: astronomical, biological, communications, linguistic, and impacts of mankind. From the very beginning, the subject of extraterrestrial intelligence within the IAA was thus highly interdisciplinary. The letter did not ask a specific question, only for the addressee's point of view. It neither defined what communication with extraterrestrial intelligences meant. The latter seem to assume a consensus on the meaning or leave the other side to create their own based on the 5 problems, equally unclarified. However, for the first time, someone encouraged scientists from both sides of the Iron Curtain to think of the ambiguously stated topic in an international framework. The letters prompted them to consider the question of intelligence in the universe, knowing that they belonged to a distinguished international group. Peszek was slowly dissolving boundaries by announcing a topic that only the 2 space powers could practically pursue as a subject of a desired international symposium. By leaving any definition out, yet stating the interdisciplinarity, the meaning of SETI was being left to the latitude of the addressee. The IAA made its SETI interest public. One article in Philadelphia Inquirer, signed by Frank Malina, which was a member of the IAA's Board of Trustees, called SETI research within the IAA the Intelligence Project. It noted how in 1965, Peszek proposed the possibility of communicating with extraterrestrial intelligences. And he said the project was international by its very nature, both as regards the possible execution and its implication for mankind. Further, it required the collaboration of astronomers, biophysicists, radio communication engineers, mathematicians, and linguistic experts. Malina mentioned further that more serious thought had been given in the scientific community on the subject than one might expect, especially in the Soviet Union. Peszek's written communication with Soviet Union's radio astronomers who studied extraterrestrial civilizations was, however, not easy. His letters would not always reach their addressees and vice versa. Another difficulty was convincing other organizations with a longer tradition, such as the International Astronomical Union, to support the SETI symposium. Classically trained astronomers prevailed in the International Astronomical Union. The majority had been reluctant to the new field of radio astronomy just a couple of decades before. Towards SETI, there was also French conservatorship. French astronomers to whom Peszek wrote initially were resistant to the subject of SETI, considering immature. Repeated attempts to convince the International Astronomical Union resulted in a final reply from its president in 1966. I take this occasion to wish the symposium a complete success in its scientific achievements. This is a field in which the accuracy of methods has to be complemented by a great serenity of mind in order for a symposium to reach its goals. This, I hope, will be achieved in the best possible way. While Peszek had ensured local support for the SETI symposium in 1965, it took until April 1967 for him to gather binding agreements internationally and have the final green light from the IAA. The symposium was supposed to occur now officially in 1969, and the actual logistical preparations could begin. However, when Peszek wrote to the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences in 1967, its deputy chief scientific secretary replied asking him to not hold the symposium in Prague. The reply emphasized that the Academy president had recommended that it should not be held in the country since, I quote, the issue is practically not addressed in the Czechoslovak Academy of Science, and there are not enough facilities here that will allow an integrated symposium to be held. Now, 1967 was very different in Czechoslovakia from 1965. The country was in a political crisis that had already drawn Moscow's attention and risked a direct intervention from the Soviet government. The peak came when, in October 1967, students clashed with the police in the historic center of Prague as they demanded basic needs to be met. Their slogan, "We want light," pointed to the absurdity of the propaganda praising the scientific technological progress of socialism. Students lacked proper equipment and, most of all, electricity in the university building. While SETI proponents, radio astronomers, and astronautics engineers were accessing different frequency ranges across the electromagnetic spectrum for extraterrestrial intelligence or other reasons, Prague students in 1967 still fought for access to the visible light on Earth. Peszek continued his efforts throughout 1967 and 1968 to convince the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences to allow the SETI symposium. In March 1968, the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences wrote to Peszek to ask more questions about the symposium. These were: how is the term defined used in the sense of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the President of the USA? Which facts support the claim about extraterrestrial intelligence? What will be the social benefit of a symposium with such a speculative topic? And isn't it more appropriate to concentrate forces on solving the problem of connection with earthly intelligences? By late April, the Academy gave in and embraced the definition of the symposium as a truly international event of its kind in the world's scientific community. Although the world was already watching tensions between Czechoslovakia and the USSR, Peszek had high hopes in the late spring and summer of 1968 for the SETI symposium realization, the next one. However, on the night between 20th and 21st of August 1968, the study of extraterrestrial civilizations would face a crossroads with the terrestrial one. The Warsaw Pact troops invaded the country of liberal forward-moving Czechoslovakia to put a halt to such a threatening trajectory. As Czechoslovakia was no longer in a position to contribute to international cooperation in SETI after August 1968, the establishment of a common terrestrial ground was now in the direct hands of the two SETI-able countries. During the 4th and 11th of September 1971, 44 high-profile scientists from different disciplines and both sides of the Iron Curtain gathered to discuss communication with extraterrestrial intelligence at the Byurakan Astrophysical Observatory in the Soviet Republic of Armenia. The entire staff of Byurakan was mobilized for the purpose. The event was called Soviet American, but included 32 scientists from the USSR and 18 scientists from the US, as well as 4 scientists, each from the UK, Canada, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Even in the absence of a Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, it is difficult to imagine that such a large number of Soviet scientists, first of all, could have been deployed to Prague for the SETI symposium. By 1971, the SETI subject had circulated widely enough to put together an interdisciplinary conference from both sides. The event assembled a critical mass to create an interdisciplinary object with radio astronomy at the center. This equally reflected the difference between the Western and the Soviet state of SETI research at the time, namely that in the Soviet Union, groups were working steadily in the field, while the US led no coordinated effort in this sense. What made Armenia a suited place for both conferences, and even more for the 1971, had to do with the fact that the Caucasian Republic lay at the periphery of the Soviet Empire, and consequently was relatively privileged or free from certain political restraints. Additionally, the 1960s tilted the balance in favor of the Republic's relative freedom to the point where these facts were visible even to the Western SETI 1971 conference attendees. For example, US astrophysicist Freeman Dyson observed in his published memoirs from the conference that Armenians were able to halt the development of the power stations around Lake Sevan, reaching a reasonable compromise between Soviet development ethos and environmental concerns. Dyson equally noted his marvel at how Armenians had obtained the right to commemorate the Armenian genocide. Now, between the two extraterrestrial conferences, the 1964 and the 1971, the Armenian genocide was elevated from a personal and psychological level to a collective and official and political one. Since the formation of the USSR, Moscow had refused to recognize the massacre to maintain safe diplomatic relations with Turkey. And privately, privileged astronomers included, Armenians always talked about it. But officially and publicly, this was not mirrored until a critical mass rose to protest on the occasion of the 15th anniversary of the genocide, that is in 1965. Hence, Armenia had just set a precedent in convincing Moscow to approve both earthly and extraterrestrially bold bottom-up initiatives. By the time of the 1971 conference, national identity and genocide recognition were rooted in Soviet Armenian political leadership policies that they were also PR images for foreigners, that is, the foreign participants at the conference. More generally, by this time, at the level of the Soviet Union, indigenous elites and intellectuals across the 15 republics made use of their strategic placement to tilt the system to the advantage of their local needs. In a more concrete case, after 1965, nationalistic forces could not be suppressed in Soviet republics. They could only be controlled or manipulated, as historians would put it. And in Armenia, this process seemed to take astronomical proportions. Supporting the argument that freedom and privilege in Armenia were much better in Moscow than in Moscow are other facts. None other than Freeman Dyson was a nonconformist and prolific scientist. He managed to become a professor by bypassing the requirement for a PhD. He proposed that civilizations might live on comets and not necessarily on planets. When asked why, he stated that comets had one major advantage: the possibility to escape from one's government. No one else dealt with the idea of being away from governments or even at the periphery, either terrestrially or extraterrestrially at the conference. Perhaps being in Armenia resembled being on a comet too much. Possible evidence in this sense is the fact, for example, that when one conference participant had just finished his doctoral dissertation in Moscow in the early 1950s, a renowned physicist, Lev Landau, advised him to return to his homeland, since he liked to think freely, and Armenia was much better suited in this sense. This came after Ter Michaelian had just made the most important discovery in his entire career, which had wide applications since then in high-energy particle and radiation physics. The terrestrial geopolitical periphery, that is Armenia as a Soviet republic in the distant Caucasus, was coupled with the role of Ambartsumian, that is Byurakan's director, and the community of astronomers he represented internationally. Ambartsumian fulfilled a prominent function in the international relations of Soviet science. Shortly after the termination of World War II, the International Astronomical Union resumed its activities at the Zurich General Assembly, that is in 1948, and Ambartsumian became from then on one of his vice presidents. He held this position until 1955. In 1947, already Ambartsumian was an honorary member of the American Astronomical Society, that is the highest honor that the society could give. His ties were established very early on with the US directly, not only within international scientific organizations, thus. And Ambartsumian was an institution in himself. He was also in collaboration with Lovell from Jordan Bank in the UK, where he traveled as early as 1957 when Sputnik was launched, and the Soviets asked Jordan Bank to help trace it. Now later, during 1961-1964, he was also International Astronomical Union president. Similarly, also by 1967, he was considered highly important in Soviet astronomy, especially for his contribution to study the center of the galaxy and its evolution. And the privileges that Ambartsumian embodied, both scientifically as a scientific persona as a diplomatic persona, allowed him to host the 1971 conference with relative ease. The trust that Soviet leadership had in him for gathering high-profile scientists from both sides of the Iron Curtain in 1971 can be taken as a measure of his prestige. His international ties in 1971 were perhaps more intense than ever. In January the same year, he was invited and accepted the invitation of the US House of Representatives Committee on Science and Astronautics to attend their annual seminar on international science policy. He was offered to sit at the head table for the seminar luncheon, sharing the table with President Nixon's scientific advisor. Ambartsumian was also the president of the International Council of Scientific Unions between 1968 and 1972. As others have documented before, the International Council of Scientific Unions during this time established a committee on global environmental problems that collaborated with the United Nations. In this heightened context of international global terrestrial and extraterrestrial cooperation, the SETI conference took place. The distance from Moscow and the seeming distance from the terrestrial political reality of the subject made the conference a rather innocent event with no political implications or stakes for power, apparently. Discussing the possibility of communication with extraterrestrial intelligence required imagining a common Earth identity as a prerequisite, at least in theory. The conference marked the extraterrestrial epitome of how world systems became one world system. The fact that the two sides could discuss the development of civilizations put to the side the question of ideology as lived terrestrially. Detonating nuclear weapons on the moon fascinating some astronomers, among which, for example, Kepler, who was a former superior of US SETI scientist Carl Sagan in the 1950s. Such plans in the US military, which Sagan also worked on but did not speak about, cannot be separated from the 1971 discussions at Byurakan. It was not surprising that dealing with nuclear explosions became present here too, just as it did in the 1964 conference. Also, the Soviet nuclear power plant at Metsamor was just about one hour away by car from Byurakan. It had been under construction since 1960. None of the participants, however, intervened to comment on the nuclear threat on a terrestrial note. Distant extraterrestrial and generic civilizations were no doubt epistemically much easier to access. All in all, despite hindrances, epistemic or otherwise, the conference came close to Andrei Sakharov's 1968 manifesto of vision of world peace based on cooperation between the US and the USSR and the eventual convergence of the two systems of government. The dissident physicist wrote a memorable note to the conference participants, from which was read at the end of a panel on consequences of contact. He said, "Such an information, that is, a message from an extraterrestrial civilization, would be dangerous for silly and rude men. Being away in Armenia had, at least in part, an element of being away from one's government, be it Soviet, US, or universal in this sense." Now, Armenia served as an alternative to the consequences of the Prague Spring on communication with extraterrestrial intelligence. And extraterrestrial intelligence, even if invisible optically, was potentially visible outside of the electromagnetic spectrum's optical range. Now, similarly, extraterrestrial intelligence was invisible to governments in Armenia, but visible and as an international endeavor. Enabling this process, Byurakan Astrophysical Observatory preserved Cold War extraterrestrial intelligence, which was inherent a product of both sides of the Iron Curtain. The survival of extraterrestrial intelligence research depended on the presence of both sides. The efforts to make it international and to involve each other was realized in this 1971 conference. The demands were also different for the community than before, and Byurakan served these demands. By 1971, extraterrestrial intelligence has transgressed to an international SETI framework. To ground it truly, an international symposium was needed, and Byurakan's scientific internationalism tools allowed this to happen. The gathering was independent of the IAA, despite entertaining some tangential connections with it. For example, Rudolf Peshev was present, but he did not present. Now, the history of the Cold War SETI cannot be comprehended without the role of Armenia and Czechoslovakia. The Byurakan's Astrophysical Observatory, the Armenian astronomical and larger scientific community, its relations with Moscow, were key in advancing SETI research in the USSR and as a cooperation between East and West. These two conferences, the 1961, the All-Soviet one, and the Soviet-American one from 1971, they were primary milestones in SETI research. With the prevailing US history and Soviet history being equated to Soviet Russia, other paramount aspects risk at the moment staying invisible. Also, actors from the Eastern Bloc, such as the Czechoslovakian Rudolf Peshev, they advanced the topic of SETI in the agenda of international institutional bodies, such as the IAA, and on the International Astronomical Union, no matter how successful, actively engaged in this transfer of knowledge with the West. The very term SETI originates in an initiative from the Eastern Bloc. One of the results of reconstructing the history of SETI Enterprise as International is the first overview of its community. The fact that the electromagnetic signals across the spectrum could inform about the presence of stars, planets, life, and technology gave rise to a new field with its own paradigm. And additionally, SETI research was about establishing a continuum between the capitalist and socialist civilizations as much as it was about listening to one another to better listen to the cosmos. More generally, the question is in reconstructing the SETI history as truly international, what can one actually additionally gain further? And if you want to read more and have time, these are a few of my works on it. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you so much, Gabriela. I mean, I feel you should live at the observatory because you are now a walking wealth of incredibly detailed knowledge. And I did notice that they have had quite exciting initiatives like art pop-ups for a number of days that have allowed artists into the observatory to set up installations. When I'm watching you, I'm so struck because a lot of the work I do at the moment is for the SETI Post-Detection Hub in St. Andrews, that the same problems and challenges that, you know, were being encountered over 50 years ago, the problem of summarizing it, of defending what SETI might be, the radio astronomy scientists not necessarily thinking it's a good idea to talk about aliens because of the UFO craze, which, you know, goes on now. And yeah, this search for funding and juggling meetings and juggling people. It's a funny analog for the process of doing SETI or something which is held within SETI, which is the hope, I guess, that we could communicate across quite radical differences. So I will invite Nina, if you would like to just reflect, I think, through your experience, Nina, having lived a life which in some sense you have lived experience from this region, and your creative and professional life has involved you in the world of space science and technology.
Thank you very much for your fantastic talk, which was so well put together with all sorts of amazing, important information. Thank you so much. I cannot talk that much about SETI. I can talk only very little, but I can talk more about, number one, those decades before the Iron Curtain came down and before and after, shortly after, which then continued for quite a few decades. And I just would like to remark on the fact that there was such, not only about SETI, but generally about astronomy and about various hypotheses, observations. There was a very, very unknown world of research in Russia. And to this day, we don't know enough about it. There were individuals, and they were not necessarily imprisoned, but they were made quiet and put on the side and, just silenced. And this is very interesting. And after, like in the 90s or so, late 80s, 90s, and so on, there were all sorts of very important and intriguing arts and science events which were based or connected very closely to astronomy and to space. So, for example, we have in Okno was an organization, I think now there's maybe a little bit left of it, and together with Guy van Bell, who is originally Belgian, and Anna-Marie Mays, we did a number of events where we invited Russian scientists talking about space-related issues and SETI and so forth. And I think this is just my experience, but there might be several other places. Also, there were in the turn of the century, there were artist workshops, but big ones. There was one series in up in the north in Finland, which was called the Polar Circuit, and it was an annual event. And then we all moved to the south, and we had this solar circuit. And just recently, they asked me about it. And the solar circuit was in a former convict island, and we slept in the original bunk, but it became a protected nature area. And so we had kangaroos and wallabies and Tasmanian devils, and it was a little bit, and snakes. But we had very great discussions daily. There was no internet, there was no electricity, no telephone. And a number of these conversations were actually concentrated on either phenomena like the northern light and the southern light and the interpretation by scientists and by folklore and indigenous people and so forth. And then connected also to this, there are special curators and people like Annick Bureau, who is Paris, France based, and she has done a lot about women in space and space research and so forth. So these are, if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk to you about it. But at Okno, we had a very strong connection with Russian astronomers. And we had symposiums where we collaborated and so forth. So there is a lot of these scientific art, you name it, collaborations, which is just not necessarily known because it's not in the middle of things, and it's still very important.
Yes, and I think actually these meetings in the early, well, the 1971 so clearly was an interdisciplinary meeting, and I guess that does tie in with your experience of holding the diverse meetings, Nina. I think ties in with a question that was forming for me around how did being in Armenia, the food, the drink, the community of the observatory itself, how did that influence, do you think, Gabriela, the way that the conversation was held and the kinds of ideas and priorities and essentially imaginaries that came out of it, and that sense of archaeoastronomical deep history of Armenia? I wonder if you have plans to keep on researching that, because it sounds so deep.
Thank you very much for the comments. You've addressed like a lot of things. I will start with in the opposite order. So on archaeoastronomy and the study of extraterrestrial civilizations, there is a lot to say about that. And I recently published a paper, and you can, if you cannot access it because it's maybe behind a paywall, just let me know. And I think definitely there can be more. So the article is just a short piece of what I've done. And I think that's important to be read because it's it speaks so much about Armenian identity, and it explains a certain period, especially the 1960s, and how national identity could be expressed through scientific activity in a different way than before. Like with regards to the being in Armenia for the conference, how it influenced like the food including and the atmosphere. You can also read the memoirs or the sketches that are autobiographical by Josef Shklovsky, who was the #1 SETI pioneer in the Soviet Union. And he wrote also very vividly, and he recalled the conference, and he speaks about that this was, they were kind of at the foot of Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark was supposed to have landed, right? So, and this imaginary is actually reproduced by others at the conference. So, for example, William McNeill, US historian who participated at the conference, he also talks about this. He's very critical about the SETI studies, and he considers the astronomers to think very limited in terms of like what history means or civilizations and so on. But he appreciates the atmosphere of the conference. Now, similarly, also Freeman Dyson, he talks about the atmosphere and being in Armenia, and there is always this imaginary of that they are where this ancient civilization has been founded. Now, with regards to other places where SETI in the former Soviet Union was developing an interdisciplinary, yes, I think there's a lot. So, for example, while I was looking into the archives of Rudolf Pesek, the person who came up with communication with extraterrestrial intelligence, in one document, only in one instance, I could find the proof that had been a meeting in Kharkiv in Ukraine on SETI. I don't remember exactly in this moment. In 1965, yes, in 1965, just after 1 year after the first Byurakan conference. And nowhere in any Soviet source that I looked I could find this. So only there it was because Shklovsky or someone else at one point gave this information. So there is so much that has been lost. And I mean, there has to be like more collection and communication about these sources because there is a rich history. And in my dissertation, I also tried to bring like to light like certain other places. Like for example, there is one radio astronomer who comes from radio engineering, Vsevolod Troitsky, who is also he's in Nizhny Novgorod, and he basically does a lot of SETI research. Then I try to show like what a little bit like how he frames those ideas, and then like later it is a little bit maybe more known like what happens in the post-Soviet era. There are these messages being sent from Crimea, from the planetary radar there in Evpatoria, and they are like sent by the Russian scientists with the help of the international community. And for me, I find that the roots of the significance of sending those messages, that they are quite visible in the period before. But I can only make arguments on the basis of ideas that are being circulated, not on the actions, because of the limitation of sources. So definitely, I think there is much more to that. And those transmissions are they really explore art a lot. So there's a concert for theremin being sent and so on. And there's a lot there. And I think I try in my work to bridge the two periods and to show the Soviet roots of what happened later.
Oh, it's so interesting. And just to think that Shklovsky, in his famous book, Intelligent Life in the Universe, which was translated by Sagan, Carl Sagan, although he really wrote his own book. Oh, Jess, that's fine. Thank you. See you soon, Jess. He used the example of ancient Mesopotamia and Persia, which is relevant today because today is Nowruz, the celebration all through Iran, and he talks about the transmission of Babylonian astronomical knowledge, and you know there was a lot of pushback in reviews at the time of bringing these things up. And it just occurred to me when I was reading your PhD, Gabriela, that some of the inclusion of the society points are actually basically kind of ideological points, because they're not really social scientists exactly. There's particularly for me living in Aotearoa, one of the researchers, Stent, refers to quite an extraordinary description of how he sees the Polynesian culture. And he speaks of a galactic Polynesian archipelago whose tenants are mostly concerned about their inner life and not anxious to communicate with beings in other planetary systems, or particularly with us. This is his idea of how a kind of non-capitalist ET civilization might be thriving out there in a Polynesian way, which is it's weirdly, you know, it's linked to some ideas that very much are part of the, say, the Pacific imaginaries of Oceania, in terms of being relational, but it's so very much a romanticized ideal that clearly the kind of Western scientists are projecting. And he says the Polynesian societies had overcome the Faustian compact, that they had overcome the will to power. I actually will just open it to everyone because I know it's a long session, and I would love to hear your questions.
I've definitely noticed like that the limits of their interdisciplinarity, like they are quite obvious, I think, for anyone coming from like humanities when looking like, and especially today, looking in retrospect at what the discussions they had. I mean, definitely they had like certain views. I mean, I think the interest in interdisciplinarity is laudable, but I mean, I think there are certain points in which like why social sciences or humanities were not so well represented. But from the point of view of the Soviet Union, there was no one actually to address those. So while you had radio astronomers from each side, you could, you had a much more direct conversation in that. And I think the people that we could actually bring to discuss more humanities or social sciences, I think they had to have a certain, I'm not sure if relation to, like, I mean, in my point, like what I do in the dissertation, I try to show that they were kind of like quasi or perceived Marxism in a certain way, and that's what like kind of brought them into the conference. But I think that remains to be seen. And I mean, I do make a lot of a lot of notes, and I can understand how the Polynesian aspect might have you might see it. So yeah, I think we have a question.
I would like to comment on one hand on that this is not only about Russia and the former Soviet Union, but in generally in countries they have certain high points which everybody talks about. But for example, in Russia, on the very far eastern end, there is which is still operating, a big science university. And by now you can talk with them with Zoom. They have some courses are in different other languages, and there are a variety of science thought, and nobody ever heard about them. I mean, that's one thing, and I just bring this as one example. And the other thing is that I feel that, when I was able to do it, I am able to do it. It's so important that whatever we work with, whatever science we work with, that we try to find opportunities that we do some big public events. So we did with through Leonardo with Annick Bureau and I and Roger Molina in Budapest, an event. It was at the Academy of Science, and we had international astronomers and space people. And something like this is, it's not like, just news today, but it is something which is much more broader and out on the public.
Thank you so much. But let's have Angelica's question as well, and then maybe you can do this responding to two questions at the same time.
Thank you so much. Just a quick question. I was impressed by all of these details, and it was so vivid, almost like the movie documentary. Thank you so much. And maybe I missed, but looking in the photos, we cannot see females. Is it something, how to say, strange, because in those times Communist Party forced, female to do, things in the factories, and I think maybe pushing females into something that, it is not for them. But at the same time, we can see that in the, how to say, natural sciences, and in this conference, we can see only the males at the photos. Is it, some trend, or maybe just just the chance?
Yes, so first of all, radio astronomy at this time is a very male-dominated field. There are mostly like engineers coming into it. There are very few that come from astronomy. There are nonetheless like some female radio astronomers. Only one of them participates in the first 1964 conference and presents. She presents with a male researcher. I could find very little on her, so it's very difficult to actually find more about her. In the 1971 conference, there are only males. There are a few women in the picture of the participants, but they were actually the stenotypistin, and another woman is the one who actually takes the picture and is the partner and wife of Philip Morrison, who always came accompanied by his wife because he had a physical disability. He had polio, and he was always in a wheelchair, so he always needed his wife. So and they are usually just people doing other things, so they are not the scientists themselves in this period. So that is one thing. It's not that the Soviet Union doesn't encourage women to be scientists. It kind of makes it a propaganda that women join the scientific class, so to speak. And there are like very prolific astronomers. So one of them at Byurakan Astrophysical Observatory is Alma Parsamian, the one who turns to archaeoastronomy. The thing is that her name doesn't appear in the proceedings of the 1964 conference because she doesn't speak, or at least her words are not documented. But she was there, present in the room, because there is no list of who was in the room. There is only the list of who presented for that conference. What I'm not sure if I answered that question. So there is kind of like a propaganda to make like women not stay at home, but actually make them part of the scientific community. And this is kind of like it's a lot of propaganda, but actually it happens, and women are encouraged in this sense to a certain extent because there are very few at the same time. So now this has, changed more or less in SETI. Still, there are very few women in Soviet and Russian SETI. I know of one other person, at least in the Soviet period. So yes.
Thank you so much. Maybe it will be also helpful to hear about females. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I totally agree.
Harry, would you like to say something? Yes.
Hello, everyone. I am Harry Mogoshanu. I live in New Zealand, and I'm a research scientist with the BMSIS in the US, which is a really wonderful nonprofit organization that does a lot of this work, and we look into these subjects many times. Congratulations, Gabriela. This has been the most interesting presentation, and I have been intrigued by it because Kate told me about you, and I was really looking forward to hearing it. And indeed, it's been a most wonderful presentation. So well done. I can imagine it's been like a lot of work. But I don't have questions, but I want to raise some points. One is, I don't think many people understand what it was like living behind the curtain wall, the Iron Curtain. Okay. And you seem very young. I don't know. I don't know how much experience you had in that. I think a lot of us kind of like today don't even understand the struggles and the issues that our parents had during that time, and with all the communication issues that people had, because you couldn't talk, you had restrictions. If you said something, you would have been thrown in prison. There was no free speech. There was nothing like that. So having organized these conferences was something extraordinary. But I do know marginally because I did some research of my own for one of my projects, which was how civilian space research got institutionalized. And I did that from a perspective of international security. And so one of the things that I kind of like came to a conclusion, understood, was the fact that there was a huge disinformation campaign as well going on at the same time from the former Soviets, which kind of like was saying that we never landed on the moon. All of the knowledge and everything that we have here on Earth is transmitted from extraterrestrials. And I can see a direct correlation between saying that and taking agency away from people. And it's almost like a remake of a different religion where you're actually being told what to do, and you basically have no role in this, which was a stamp of the communism, right? Because you were kind of like reduced to a very tiny little thing. So that's one thing. That's one of the things. So it's very hard to understand how was it to be in there. And like I really understand and appreciate Angelica's comment about having very few women, but as you do know, even though women were involved in the science community in all the communist bloc, because we were like women were learning science and they were involved, but there was a somewhat current of dissuading women from pursuing all these not pursuing, but kind of like almost like being taken seriously, even though everybody was like doing a lot of science. So that's one thing. But the other thing is with the Pacific people, I mean, this is a conversation and it's a good conversation, but here in New Zealand, I had the opportunity to talk to many Pacific navigators. I made a planetarium movie called The Navigators that is playing in the planetarium here in New Zealand. It's been shown at the international conferences and places, and it's about a comparison between European and Pacific navigation. But when I started research in that was for me to understand the differences, but also between the two systems of navigation, but also looking into the future and seeing how our future will unfold as talking across cultures and getting rid of all these cultural biases in our understanding of each other and in understanding of how every culture communicates and what actually really are meant to say, not what they're saying or what do we perceive that they're saying, but what is it that actually they're saying. And that's a barrier that is made by culture, by expressions, by language, by all of these things. But what I do know is that the Pacific people have a really wonderful, and I'm talking about Pacific people because you can include Polynesians, but then they're Melanesians, they're Micronesians, so it's everybody, all the communities in the Pacific, they're called the Pacific communities. And so they do have this wonderful way of looking at the universe. And unlike being restricted by religion, as many of us were in other parts of the world, they trace their descendants directly from the sky, literally. So their whakapapa or genealogy is descending from stars, from the sky. So that's pretty special. And I know that majority of cultures around the world do that, but they're a bit more vocal in saying it. And especially places that haven't been colonized with religion are affirming this, that we're all coming from there. So their approach, from what I have perceived, is very open and they don't see any issue in connecting with the universe and going to space and finding other beings out there. So that's what I wanted to say.
I think I have to say, first of all, I forgot to say thank you to everyone because all the comments are so interesting and so well thought. So I feel very good in your company. And so particularly with this, I think this ties a little bit into the I don't know, the exotic element, so to speak. So, so all these scientists, they kind of have like a fascination with, let's say, very distant civilizations like terrestrial or distant ideas. So how the idea of SETI actually comes, so there is this 1959 article of Searching for Interstellar Communications that I showed at the beginning. That is, the textbook history of SETI starts with that. They say, okay, these two particle physicists, one of them worked on the Manhattan Project. They come up with this idea, like how to search for other civilizations in the universe. How would they communicate if there are others there? And they write this article that shows that with this technology, we could do this. And this is 1959. And they publish it in Nature. So it's kind of from that moment on, this is legitimate. Maybe others were thinking about it. There was a search that was being prepared at that time at Green Bank, but Frank Drake, the person preparing the search, he doesn't want to go public with the director there because they are like, no, this is kind of weird. But once the article is out, they're like, oh, we have to be the first. So let's do it. And in retrospect, I feel Haley Morrison, like one of the authors, when he's interviewed, he says that Actually, I think like what inspired me was that I was reading Joseph Needham's, who was a historian who, like, he documented the first time the scientific history of China. And in that year, the volume on astronomy appeared. And this really changed like the view of the West on the history of science in China. And he said like reading about the plurality of the worlds in Chinese cosmology and so on, it really influenced me when without realizing it. And he was like, he was sure that this was something that influenced him. And I think like also maybe this ties like with ideas like in the Soviet Union, especially these Eastern religious ideas. I can connect it with that one. And I can see that the question of like sending signals and the idea of that there is a pre-existing idea among Soviet scientists that somehow civilizations are already connected because there is this mind of the it's kind of connected with the Vernadsky idea and so on. And it's like a continuum of ideas in this sense. And for them, it makes sense to send signals. So the idea of communication is much more natural, so to speak, not to search for them, but to communicate because we are somehow already connected. And I think this really continues to this day. And you can see like some of the scientists, they become like very philosophical with time. Like one of them is Lev Kindelis. So he starts as an astronomer. I'm not sure how much he actually does as an astronomer. And he then turns into very philosophical ideas. And he's kind of like the basis for a lot of I think philosophical underpinnings for sending these messages later in the post-Soviet era. I think this is kind of like guess kind of answering through a tangent, but this is what comes.
It's a very good point because in the 1920s sometimes, and you know, I think everybody around the world thought about surely there must be someone out there. The thought of not having aliens was unimaginable. And in the 1920s, I remember in my research, I found that the US Navy, I can't remember exactly the year, but they issued a call for astronomers, and they said something of the something like this: "We just understood how to use radio waves, and we're looking for astronomers to come and listen to Mars because surely Mars has an advanced civilization, and would like to find out if they want to communicate with us. But we're very excited to communicate with them. We're a bit behind." In all of this radio technology and so on. So we need as many astronomers as possible to listen to their signals and communicate back to them as soon as possible. And as we do know, we are now struggling to even find very simple life forms on Mars because Mars doesn't have any. But I think a lot of it stems from people imagining that surely there must be, you know, like there's like a big brother. If you grow up with brothers or sisters, it's very hard to imagine being the only child, I think. And that's what humanity projects onto this search for ET.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
Sorry, if you are going to respond, that's absolutely fine. I just noticed that Emily Feiner left a question, which I think is interesting to this topic. She says, I'm interested in whether any indigenous local voices had input in any of the events at the Byurakan Conference, thinking of the way they invited a shaman to talk about the origins of the Tungus meteorite at the Moscow Planetarium, with the intention to debunk his knowledge with science, but the audience found the shaman more plausible and meaningful. I did not know that event.
Yeah, I think like one thing that has to be mentioned, like because I talked about like how Armenians express their national identity through astronomy. There's a deeper element, like this nationality is constructed during the early period of the Soviet Union. Nationality is kind of a state project. So the Soviet Union uses the national identities to build let's say, Soviet solidarity and loyalty to the Soviet system. Later, like nationalities claim this for their own purposes, but at the same time, nationality is a construct, and there are a lot of like indigenous populations and different ethnicities. And the Byurakan Observatory and the area in Metsamor, where the nuclear plant is, also has this problem. And Orgov, like another very important a scientific facility which has the only radio optical telescope that is built by Heruni, one of the persons who switches to archaeoastronomy from astronomy, is tied to that ethnic conflict, I would say. So they're definitely around those times. So those things are, there is nothing visible in this in this sense at the conference. It's very I don't know, Instagram from this point of view.
Well, that is, I mean, I very much welcome any further questions. I think for me, you've really helped me understand something I didn't know before, which was how much there's Soviet figures like Peszek had an involvement in putting SETI, CETI on the agenda, but also the theme of communication and contact itself, and I guess thinking about how deeply oppressed the ability to communicate was for people living behind the Iron Curtain must have emphasized how vital this theme, the theme of communication is. And I've noticed, as you draw out in your research, Gabriela, the way that in current times that theme of communication and contact is made secondary, or in fact maybe diminished for a more materialist understanding of detecting technosignatures. And yet I feel, particularly through this network, but through other people's work too, the return to communication, to define what communication might be, to consider communication and life in the universe as really vital questions that we have to think about the foundations of again.
Thank you for that comment. I think I have some comments that address that, and maybe some gaps that I didn't address in the other comments. Like, definitely, like this original idea of communication, yeah, it assumes that we are already connected, and I think this also relates to how SETI actually starts before the 1959 paper, because that's the textbook history. But the international astronautical community starts thinking of discussing these ideas much earlier in the context of the lack of space law. And there is the first space law practitioner who actually proposes the concept of meta law, the law regulating between other beings in the universe. And he says that we will impact other civilizations. So this is a little bit before the launch of Sputnik, when both the Soviet Union and the US announced that they're going to launch satellites. And this, of course, like the space race has started, and it's a race even much more fierce before one will be the first one. And Haley, he understands this, that radio waves will have such an impact. Now, it's kind of like if you have access to these radio waves, then you kind of have the cosmos, so to speak, and you also have much more power on Earth. And he comes up with this idea of postulating that there are other beings there that we have to protect. And the way he formulates this is that communication with them is the most important thing. And also he says even communication we have to take care even of communication with an amoeba, and we always have to take care of the semantics before we land on a planet and so on. And I think meta law is still considered today, so lawyers still talk a lot about meta law, but this original connection with radio communications as being the number one thing when we have access to the universe is completely lost. And I think this is where historians, can help a little bit, like bring that to light and show these connections that have been lost. And I think, the idea of being behind the Iron Curtain, I didn't really address it, and I think you kind of brought it out. Like, it was important to communicate. I think the idea of communication also ties in for the Soviet bloc, because it's important to be understood by the other side. They have to do much more, let's say, translation work in terms of context, language, and other things. They're kind of used to factoring in difference and the difficulty of communication, and this is, oddly enough, is visible also. I think the idea of communication has it corresponds like to the interest of Soviet power in certain ways, but also to the interest of those that try to challenge this. So the Soviet Union sends a message, the first message to aliens in the direction of Venus. It bounces off some signals in order to calculate the astronomical unit. And in 1962, it also sends these 3 words in Morse, USSR, Lenin, and the word mir, which means peace or world. And it's all over the news. It's very much propaganda. But at the same time, you have all sorts of articles popularizing the idea of communicating with other beings in the universe. And for example, one of them talks about the Paris Commune hero Blanqui, who was in prison and was trying to communicate with aliens, and connects this with the idea of communication with extraterrestrial intelligence, like in the 60s. And can you read it, for example, as something that is, yes, we are talking about the Bolshevik Revolution, but we are maybe also talking behind the Iron Curtain. We're trying to reach out. And I think SETI in the Soviet Union has this double dimension. At the same time, it's very valuable for propaganda, but at the same time, scientists could address this kind of alternative world, like out there, and discuss these things. And I think that's why communication is so important. That's kind of a detour, but I think it's related a bit.
Communication under the Soviet Empire, I mean, it was amazing. I mean, look at the Samizdat, the underground publications and books. But then beyond that, look at communication then in non-alphabetical languages. I mean, from the Inca Empire to Japan and to today, indigenous people can still communicate through sound and movement and not electronically as well as this way. So it's amazing.
Truly, it's so much links with your curating, Nina, and your work on unseen languages and the new work you're doing on light. And I guess just to conclude the session, I was also thinking, about Sputnik and the beginning of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and how we live in a moment of time where we have to doubt whether there is any use of these international groups or the United Nations or international justice. And I wondered whether through your research, looking at people who were working under extreme conditions in extreme political instability and oppression on their freedom of speech, can any of this illuminate the situation that we are in now in 2025? Is there's something about the persistence of characters like Peszek and these scientists who insistently said, no, we will work together, we will meet together, despite it all. Is there something that might be relevant to today's attempt to create and further knowledge cultures, particularly, I would say, the interest in cosmo-imaginaries, connecting with fields that are studying cultural diversity and the indigenous studies research of outer space. And all of this now apparently is really not allowed on the agenda, according to Donald Trump's edicts that ban words like cultural and diversity, which is almost unfathomable. And the process of writing a recent submission to NASA was made very difficult by not being allowed to say some key words. So is there anything that we might learn for the moment we're in now, this really intense and very difficult moment?
I think there's definitely, like, the first thing that I would say is valuable is that imagination is valuable and has a lot of potential, and just cultivating that one and not giving into whatever is easier. I think that's the most important lesson. I mean, if these scientists could use their imagination for political purposes, and also like their scientific imagination, that they could have always the two things go together. When you never do like science, neutrally. It matters like how you orient yourself in the world. And I think that's the most important thing. Whatever you do, the value of what you put out there is determined by your position to power and how you stand for what it means to be human, what it means to cultivate freedom. And I think that's the most important thing, that these people, they were making an effort to be authentic politically and scientifically at the same time. And I think that's something that risks to be lost. And not only with, yes, the Trump administration is a totally new level of it, but I think the commercialization of thought and of intellectual products is particularly threatening. And it's kind of like the base on which madness that is happening currently can happen. And I think if every person, makes an effort of like sticking to this, I think we'll be safe, so to speak.
Yes, if any of people assembled have any other words on that, I never want to close down a moment where people are sharing resistance strategies that really might be needed right now. Yes, are there any?
Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. And thank you, Hari. Thank you, Angelica, for the wonderful questions. And thank you, Kate, for organizing this very, very nice event.
Kate. Hurrah, Kate. Hurrah.
Thank you so much. It's such a joy. Okay, so closing words would just be to thank you all for your time and your deep thought and consideration. This is such detailed research, and it seems to me that there is certainly a book in this and more research to come, perhaps more meetings. I also have a note from a previous speaker, Juan Francisco Salazar, that his film Cosmographia is now out, and maybe we will have a showing of that in a few months. But for those in New Zealand, it will be showing at Maoriland Film Festival next weekend on the Saturday. It's a really great kind of cosmic creative narrative made with a dancer from Aotearoa, filmed in the deserts in Chile around the ALMA telescope. It looks fun. It looks great. And yes, with that, I wish you good night, good rest, Angelica. Good day, Harry. Nina, I'm not sure it's, this movement into
Afternoon.
Yes. But thank you very much for gathering. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.